With us now are Dr. Max Moore, Bill Faloon, and Neal VanDeRee. A pleasure and honor to have you on the show, sir.
Thank you.
Good to see you again, Bill.
Very good, Richard.
Our subject today, obviously, is cryonics, a topic that has been ridiculed, and you've all been subjected to so much skepticism. Dr. Moore, tell us a little bit about the initial skepticism you have faced.
Well, that skepticism is gradually turning around. I'm finding more and more people are realizing that what we're doing is clearly consistent with the laws of physics. It's actually not too different from, at least the early stages of what we do are very similar to organ donation, in that what we're trying to do is preserve viability of tissues for as long as possible, and then preserve the cells and preserve the person's brain and identity in the hopes that one day we can repair and revive the damage that led to what we call death today, which is not really death, and revive someone in a healthy young body. So people look at this idea and say, well, how could that possibly happen? Well, if you look at it, it's really not that implausible. We already cryopreserve corneas and eggs and sperm and skin cells and heart valves and many different types of tissue. And there's been some success cryopreserving entire organs. So it really doesn't seem that implausible to think that we can cryopreserve a whole human being. The difficult part is that we haven't yet revived someone. So the most typical criticism is, well, have you brought anybody back yet? And the answer is, well, no, of course not. We don't have that kind of technology yet. That doesn't make cryonics pointless, because once someone's down at that very low temperature, minus 320 Fahrenheit, minus 196 degrees C, we can wait. There's no biochemical activity. We can wait for a century or more if we need to, until we do have that technology to revive the person in a young, healthy state.
Absolutely fascinating. Bill, what would you add to that? You actually were right from the forefront pioneering this technology.
Well, what I want to add to the science of cryonics is the emerging science of age reversal in human beings. And I'm going to be giving a lot of lectures over the next couple months about an emerging technology where we take plasma from young bone marrow mobilized individuals and transfuse that into older people with the objective of inducing meaningful and systemic reversal of their aging process. And why that's so important is, when it comes to cryonics, a big objection is, well, I don't want to come back when I'm old and frail. Well, with age reversal technology that may be demonstrated over the next few years, cryonics will become much more appealing. Once people understand you don't have to come back old, you may come back rejuvenated.
And there is actually a dramatic turning point publicly with all sorts of prominent individuals and very successful business leaders, billionaires in fact, all advocating this. Neal, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and a common misnomer with cryonics, Richard, is that it's something that only billionaires do, but that's not the case. The cost of cryonics is the cost of less than a Starbucks coffee a day. So it's something that's available to anyone that would be interested in doing it. At this point in time, people have the opportunity, the choices. You have a choice of being buried, you have a choice of being cremated, or you have the choice of being cryonically suspended with the hopes and possibility of coming back in the future. That's the only one that gives you the possibility of coming back.
Bill, tell our audience a little of the history and how it is that procedures that were regarded as impossible years ago are now possible, basically validating the basic philosophy of what you're doing.
Well, I can talk about medical procedures, or maybe something more people are familiar with, the Apple iPhone. In January 2007, when that was announced, the highest level computer engineers working for the competitor of Apple thought it was impossible. They didn't think you could do all of that with a telephone. And sure enough, it happened. Virtually everyone has an iPhone right now. So that's just one little analogy where only 8-9 years ago, people didn't think it could happen, but it did happen virtually overnight. As it relates to medical technology, we're constantly seeing an evolving situation where diseases that were once considered terminal are being cured.
Dr. Moore, tell us more about Alcor and the clientele and basically what the plans are, where it is currently in technology.
Well, Alcor was founded in 1972, so we've been around for quite a few years now, 43 years ago, and we're a non-profit organization. It was founded really with the idea, not as a business, but because the founders themselves wanted to carry on living. We decided that life is good and we want to carry on having more life. And the fact that our bodies fail at a certain point is really just an accident of nature. Evolution had no interest in building a body that could last indefinitely. Essentially, once you reach reproductive age, it doesn't care what happens to you. You've already passed on your genes. So one of the objections to cryonics, or to life extension in general, is often that when your time comes, it's your time. Well, what is this time? There is no time. We live a lot longer now than we did in the past. So the idea of cryonics is really that it puts life on pause, because you have some conditions considered fatal today, but something that will be curable in the future. It essentially puts you on biological pause so you can wait until that time when you can fix the problem. So Alcor over the years has developed more and more sophisticated technologies, often in conjunction with other organizations that have done research in this area, to improve the cryoprotection of the cells. Essentially what we want to do is eliminate ice formation in the cells. Even though it's not true, as many people say that ice makes the cells explode from the inside, that's not really what happens, but it's certainly undesirable to have ice, so we've managed to eliminate ice formation under good circumstances. Improve response times, improve the financial stability of the organization, and generally constantly improve our ability to respond and minimize the damage done during that process. Alcor's philosophy, unlike some organizations really, is that we want to minimize the damage that has to be repaired in the future. We can think of our friends in the future 100 years from now as having these magical, powerful technologies, but that doesn't mean they can fix everything. So it's our responsibility to do the best we can to minimize the damage on this end and have as little as possible to fix in the future.
What I find fascinating also is the dilemma many people face with regard to organ transplants and how the viability of a heart to be transported, say, from Texas to New York is in great peril with time, but your technology will make it possible for that heart to be made viable for months or years, and no rush and no urgency.
Yes, exactly the same kind of research going into organ cryopreservation and cryobanking would be completely relevant to what we're doing. In fact, we work very closely with researchers, and Mr. Faloon funds a lot of that research too. So imagine that instead of trying to find a tissue match across the country and rush it across on ice, instead you can go to the hospital and they have a tissue bank, a cryobank of organs that are tissue matches already, and you can just pull one out and you can use that. That's an intermediate step, by the way, because eventually we'll just regenerate the organs probably. But that kind of work, which is really progressing very well right now, clearly benefits cryonics because it shows that you can in fact cryopreserve organs and rewarm them and reimplant them and they function. Well, we're just a collection of organs essentially, and the brain being the most important one for personality as an organ. If we can cryopreserve that, then people should suddenly see, well, cryonics makes sense. You're actually preserving the person, you're preserving the cells, you're preserving identity. It's really kind of like being in a very deep coma for probably several decades. Eventually you'll come out of that coma, and as Bill says, you'll not come back as an old person, you're going to be rejuvenated and regenerated. So you'll come back with the wisdom of old age, but the health and youth of a young body.
And so much hope going along with it. Bill, your initiatives not only are to assist humanity, but also to preserve species, endangered species. Tell our audience a little bit about that endeavor.
Well, that's part of the endeavors with some of the projects we have in Texas with our timeship project. We have over 1,000 acres of land in the Texas Hill Country. It's the most safe area of the country from the standpoint of natural and man-made disasters. And we have some buildings up there already that are going to be doing some research on some improved storage technologies. Eventually, we will have a 6-acre reanimation research facility that will also house cryopreserved patients in the intermediate temperature storage area where there may be less damage. So that's one of our bigger projects right now, is the timeship located right outside of San Antonio in Texas.
A collection of initiatives, so very interesting. And Neal, you're here the officiator of the Church of Perpetual Life. Tell our audience in a nutshell again what the purpose of this church is.
Well, Perpetual Life, Church of Perpetual Life in Hollywood, has presentations on a regular basis, typically one a month. And one of the key things with all of this, with life extension and with cryonics, one of the key things is to reach to people and to explain to people what the current technologies are and what the future technologies may hold in store. So at Perpetual Life, we have presentations on emerging technologies and on past technologies that have not been recognized as things that work for people today. So we have a number of great speakers over the year. We've had Dr. Aubrey de Grey. We're very pleased to have Dr. Max Moore joining us to speak. We've had Martine Rothblatt. Bill Faloon speaks at many of our presentations and does wonderful presentations, and we look forward to them, to each of them.
A fascinating lecture series. Bill, add your thoughts to this.
Well, we set up this church in order to bring people together who believe in the future, who believe that technology will evolve in such a way to eradicate pathological aging, to eradicate involuntary death. We see the future very clearly, and we're increasingly bringing people on board who agree with us. They're understanding that it doesn't have to work today the way it's always worked in the past. In other words, people do not have to grow old and involuntarily die. They can intervene into that process. And we promote more and more people intervening in more and more ways to accomplish the ultimate objective.
Dr. Moore, tell us of the milestones in Alcor, the most important events that have occurred so far, and what you're at the threshold of seeing coming up shortly.
Gosh, the milestones, well, I guess some of them are legal, some are financial, some are organizational. There's a lot of different areas, really, so to pick a few milestones is difficult. But one of the most obvious ones would be around 2000, 2002, when we introduced vitrification. Essentially, vitrification, people commonly say that we freeze people. Well, that's not technically true, or it's certainly not what we want to do in cryonics. Vitrification is where you introduce a high concentration of the cryoprotectant, essentially medical grade antifreeze, if you like. And at a high enough concentration, when you cool down below a certain temperature, this material just gets more and more viscous and solidifies into a kind of a resin-like glass. So there's no internal structure, unlike crystallization. So that was something that initially could be applied only to neuro patients, just to preserve people's brains, but eventually we learned how to do that to a whole body patient, I think around 2002, 2003. So that was a major milestone. It's not maybe quite as big a leap as some people think, because it was kind of a really gradual transition of increasing cryoprotectant concentrations, but that was an important move forward. I think other things are having a patient care trust fund, and we're the only cryonics organization that has that. Essentially, this is a separate organization within the organization with a separate board of trustees that manages the money for our patients, because they can't help themselves, they're helpless. So these are people who have, I think 2/3 of that board have to have relatives who are cryopreserved, so they have a very personal interest in managing that money well. And that money has to last indefinitely, because we don't know how long it'll be until we can attempt revival. It'll certainly be decades, it could be a century. So that, I think, is, people may think of the technical improvements, but that's a very important milestone, having a patient care trust fund that will never run out of money, will always grow enough to pay for the cost of maintaining patients and cover inflation and so on. So those are just a couple of many of the major improvements that we've made over time.
You actually created the term cryonics, I believe, and it has now expanded into quite a few countries. Tell us of this, please.
Well, the term cryonics was conceived of in the late 1960s, but when I got involved in cryonics, there were very few people who were signed up to have the process done. And the organizations were not structured in the way they are today, where there is an independent trust fund to ensure that those patients remain in cryopreservation and that they have funding perhaps to reanimate them in the future. But there also were not the medical facilities in place. And what we've done over the last several decades is put in place research laboratories aimed at perfecting the cryopreservation process. And at the rate that we're going, there will be a point where we could theoretically cryopreserve an individual and bring them back whenever we wanted. It would just be a matter of curing whatever disease caused them to die. And that's the aim that we have at the research facilities that we support in the Southern California area.
I believe that some experiments have taken place in which even large mammals have been basically preserved and then brought back to life. Tell our audience about that.
Well, what's been done at these laboratories is large animals have had their temperature reduced to just above freezing, and they remained in that state 6 to 7 hours, where they are cold dead by every measurement. We rewarm those animals, and they are revivable. They come back to life. Now, they were not cryopreserved. In other words, we did not vitrify those animals. We got them close to the freezing temperature, we rewarmed them, and we brought them back. And if you ever participate in an experiment like that, it makes you realize how feasible this is, because it doesn't appear you're ever going to get that dead animal back. But for the most part, they do come back if you put enough effort into it.
Dr. Moore, tell us of the preservation of organs at the current technology.
Well, that's not really my area of expertise, except that I know some of the leading researchers in the area, and I know that there's some very large advances waiting in the wings. In fact, we'll have a conference this October in Scottsdale, Arizona, and some of those leading researchers will be presenting new studies on this. So it seems like we're really right on the tip now of being able to do successful organ cryopreservation. I think that's a very good sign for cryonics and will lend a lot of credibility to it. But one thing that I'd like to say is it's very important to understand, some people think that what cryonics is doing is it's freezing dead people, and that's absolutely the wrong way to think of it. Cryonics is simply an extension of emergency medicine. If you go back, say, 50 years, and somebody at this table right now, suddenly the heart stopped beating, they stopped breathing, we would have checked the pulse and said, oh, Bill's dead. And we would have sent them off to be cremated or buried. Today, of course, we wouldn't do that. We'd pants on them and start doing CPR, defibrillation, and most likely he'll come back to life. So 50 years ago, when we said that person was dead, were they dead? Well, not by today's criteria. It's the same thing today. We say, we declare you dead. What does that mean? That really just means a doctor is saying, look, I give up. There's nothing more I can do to help you. Maybe I could revive you temporarily, but what's the point? So I'm going to call you dead. It's a pretty arbitrary line. So what we're saying is, give that person to us. You've reached the limits of today's medicine. We can treat this person. We can protect their cells. We can plunge them to super cold temperatures where nothing will happen, no change will happen. And then we can simply wait until we do have the capabilities to reverse the cause of fatality.
Absolutely fascinating. Bill, how do you see the future?
I believe that the reanimation of cryopreserved patients will inevitably occur. I cannot predict how long it will take for the technology to evolve, but just looking at what's happened over the last 100 years, we've seen miracles occur in virtually every area of technology, and it's going to pertain to cryopreserved patients as well. So I've been optimistic ever since I heard about the potential to be cryopreserved as opposed to being cremated or buried, that people don't need to stay dead. It's only a temporary manifestation, and we simply need to wait for the future technology to develop in order for us to be reanimated.
Please tell our audience a little bit more about the research that you're involved with regard to actually repairing, improving, restoring people's health.
Most of the research we fund involves perfecting the cryopreservation process itself. Nanotechnology is being done from a research standpoint at the biggest corporations in the world. Whoever perfects nanotechnology will make lots of money. We don't care about them making lots of money. What we care about is gaining access to that technology, applying it to cryopreserved individuals, and using that nanotechnology as a tool to reanimate cryopreserved patients.
You recently spoke about advances in stem cell therapy. Share that with our audience.
What we're looking to do is mobilize stem cells from young blood donors, separate those stem cells into a plasma concentrate, and put that into the bodies of older people with the objective of inducing a meaningful and systemic reversal of the aging process in elderly human beings.
I'd like to go back to Neal for a second, if I may, and ask you, Neal, I understand that your activities here with this Church of Perpetual Life is gaining the interest of people worldwide. Are there more churches being founded in other countries at this point?
You know, no, this is the only church of its kind. It's the only brick and mortar transhumanist church in the world. There are many people all over the world that contact us and say, I'd love to have one in my city. Are there plans to have one in Chicago, in San Francisco, in New York, in Detroit? These people contact us, and I have to explain to them the best they can do at this time is join us through our virtual live streaming and watch our presentations after the fact. So no, at the moment there are not. Obviously in the future we certainly hope that this church will grow and grow to that measure. Yes.
Bill was talking about answering to your question, how does he see the future? And I want to kind of answer that from a different angle. One reason people don't sign up for cryonics is that they have a view of the future that's very negative, very dystopian. And why is that? Well, because we've got all these stories about the future being a horrible place. We've got Terminator machines and post-apocalyptic wastelands and Mad Max worlds. And that's what's been drilled into people's minds. But that is very, very unlikely to be the future. If you look at the long sweep of human history, it's pretty much on an upward curve. I mean, we have bounces up and down, we have some pretty bad things that happen, but overall, now is the best time in the world ever to have lived. There's no time in the past that would be better. Do you want to live when we had slavery or when we didn't have antibiotics, for instance, or no painkillers? So I think by analogy, unless we manage to really mess things up, then any future in which we revive successfully from cryonics will be a good world. It will be at least as good as today, very probably better, probably more peaceful, more healthy, better in every way. So people need to get rid of these false narratives that are very dramatic but are very unlikely to be true and realize that you're going to come back into a pretty good world.
I fully agree. What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, I share the optimistic view that things are tremendously better now than they've ever been, and people don't perceive that though. There is a book, by the way, written called The Good Old Days, They Were Terrible. And if you read that book, it's a bunch of 2-page chapters. It describes every aspect of life and how miserable it used to be. And people romanticize the past erroneously. It was quite terrible. The lifespans in 1900 were only about 45 years of age. And they've increased quite a bit, but they're going to increase exponentially as medical science evolves. So I view that future optimistically, but I base it on historic analogy. I look at how bad things were and how much improvement occurred. So this gives me a rock solid basis to say, yes, reanimation in the future is probable.
Well, on that happy thought, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Moore, and Bill, a pleasure, and Neal, thank you.